In this video, I would like to address a confusion of a kind and a misconception of a sort that definitely exists in Japan and to a certain, although lesser degree outside Japan as well. And this refers to the difference between two tests slash examinations of similar nature but of different purpose, structure, and level of difficulty. One is officially called in English the Japanese Language Proficiency Test, or 日本語能力試験 in Japanese, and is also known in its abbreviated form as JLPT, and the other is Japanese Language Examination, or Nihongo Kentei in Japanese. But before we begin talking about these two tests in particular, let me first make a brief self-introduction. My name is Evgeny Uskov, and I'm a Russian national living in Japan, and as far as it can be said, based on publicly searchable information as of January 2022, I happen to be one of 3 foreigners, in quotation marks, understood in a sense of someone who is not a native Japanese speaker and a non-native Kanji learner, who have passed the first level of the Kanji Kentei test, that is, aside from Brett Mayer and John Brobst, and possibly the only person fitting the definition of a foreigner above who has ever passed the first level of the Nihongo Kentei test. One obvious caveat, which naturally needs to be pointed out here, is that both these statements, and especially the latter one about Nihongo Kentei, are only my individual assumptions derived from the fact that I personally was not able to find any information on any other persons who may have also passed these examinations. Thus, we have 2 possible options. The first one being that these statements, assumptions, are factually true because no one else has done it, or number 2, that either one of or both of these statements slash assumptions are wrong, because although even if someone has passed those tests, they didn't bother in one way or another to make the information about their achievements publicly available on the internet. Leaving that aside, I passed the Nihongo Kentei Level 1 in November 2020 after several years of unsuccessful attempts, and the Kanji Kentei Level 1 in February 2021 on my 15th or maybe 16th try. Okay, so enough about yours truly, and now let us return to the main topic of this video, which is comparison and or an attempt at disambiguation of the Japanese language proficiency test on the one hand and the Nihongo Kentei test on the other. As a general statement, it should be said that outside Japan, the latter, that is, the Nihongo Kentei test, is almost unheard of, and inside Japan, these 2 tests are in many cases confused together to the bewilderment at sometimes bordering on consternation or perhaps even indignation of Nihongo Kentei's takers. Speaking about their particular differences, it should be stated that first and foremost, these tests are administered by different entities, which are the Japan Educational Exchanges and Services and the Japan Foundation for the JLPT and the Nihongo Kentei Inkai for the Nihongo Kentei respectively, and exist for different, although in a way similar purposes, that is to test one's command of and a proficiency in Japanese language. The main difference is that while the Japanese Language Proficiency Test, that is JLPT, held 2 times a year in multiple locations all over the world, exists solely to test such abilities of those who study Japanese language as a foreign language. The Nihongo Kentei, conducted only in Japan, but also twice a year, can be taken by anyone regardless of which language happens to be their native one. In fact, for whatever reason, JLPT organizers openly prohibit any native Japanese speakers from taking the test, even imposing background checks on applicants to the extent that, as far as I somewhere heard, even if someone is not a native Japanese speaker, but they have a Japanese sounding name, to be qualified to take the test, they would need to prove that they were raised and received their education outside Japan. In terms of formal credentials for many non-native Japanese speakers, studying and learning Japanese language starts and ends with JLPT, usually if they are serious and persistent enough with its highest level N1, which is commonly viewed as the final goal of one's studies and an ultimate indicator of one's Japanese language proficiency. Level N1 certificate is also widely used in many situations, from admissions to educational institutions to being taken into account by the Japanese immigration authorities, among other criteria for granting stay permits. As for the format, while JLPT is solely a so-called bubble sheet multiple choice test and is checked automatically by scanning, answers for Nihongo Kentei are written down in various forms, from putting a number corresponding to the correct answer to writing specific words, expressions, or individual kanjis. So to sum up the basic facts, the Japanese Language Proficiency Test, also known as JLPT, and Nihongo Kentei are 2 completely different tests. The JLPT is a multiple choice test organized all over the world, including Japan, and is meant exclusively for those who study Japanese as a foreign language, who can later use its passing certificates, especially at the N1 level, for various purposes, from applying to schools to getting bonus points with the immigration service. The Nihongo Kentei is held only in Japan, may require writing answers by hand, and although it's open to anyone who can apply for it and take it, is mostly intended for native Japanese speakers. As for the practical value of the Nihongo Kentei, passing at certain levels can count for academic credits, at some educational institutions or give bonus points to applicants for certain job positions that require a better than average command of Japanese language. The confusion between the two is caused by the Nihongo Kentei's relatively low profile, not only outside Japan, where its publicity is almost non-existent, but in Japan as well, as very few ordinary people are aware of its existence at all, let alone have any clear understanding of its content or have ever taken it. And considering somewhat similarly sounding names, when they hear Nihongo Kentei, many Japanese people may think that since it is a Japanese language test, it must have something to do with testing the level of Japanese of those for whom it is not their native language, that is to say, gaikokujin. Examples of such cases of mistaken identity can be found in many job offer descriptions that ask for their prospective candidates to have some, usually the first level of the, in quotation marks, Nihongo Kentei. So how these two tests can be compared in terms of their content and relative difficulty? Well, JLPT has 5 levels, with the highest being the N1, and Nihongo Kentei has 7 levels, with the highest being level 1. But to avoid going into much details, here I would like to focus exclusively on the highest levels of the respective exams. Some sources say that in order to pass the JLPT N1, a person needs to have a working vocabulary of about 10,000 words. And although this may sound a bit too much, it may as well be true, depending on what can be considered to constitute a word in this context. As for the N1's questions, while some parts of the vocabulary and grammar sections are rather straightforward and would not be of any difficulty whatsoever for an average native Japanese speaker, the reading comprehension section, although definitely not as difficult, can to a certain degree be compared to the centralized university admission exam in Japan for high school graduates, or the so-called sentashken, and may require even native speakers to read and analyze the text thoroughly to give a correct answer. As for the listening part, while it surely does require paying attention to the conversations featured there, native Japanese speakers would face no difficulty in answering its questions correctly. So in a nutshell, unless they maybe have some specific learning disabilities or actively trying to fail the test, it is nearly impossible to think that an average native Japanese speaker would not be able to pass the N1 level of JLPT. Whether they would be able to get a perfect score is another question, as in addition to general language proficiency, it would require maintaining high level of attentiveness throughout the whole duration of the test. Although some may disagree, but what also makes N1 relatively easy to pass, even when we are talking about non-native Japanese speakers for whom it is designed for in the first place, is its quite low passing threshold of less than 60% of correct answers. But what about the first level of the Nihongo Kentei? Would it be possible for an average native speaker to pass it right away without any preparation? The answer is unequivocally no. Absolutely no. Not even for the level pre-1, which is awarded to those who get at least 70% of correct answers, and with level 1 proper requiring at least 80% and at least 50% accuracy for each of the constituent sections. I will not go here into detailed description of the Nihongo Kentei Level 1's content, but to give a general idea as to how difficult it is, it would suffice to say that the passing rate can fluctuate from late teens and early 20s to single digits for particularly difficult tests. And while questions in sections on polite speech and reading comprehension may theoretically be answered by simply having a generally good command of Japanese language, providing you have enough time to think and thoroughly read the texts given for reading comprehension section, which can be several pages long. Sections on vocabulary and kanji go far, far beyond the material taught in schools, for example, and require substantial amount of preparation for those specific parts of the test, which to a large extent overlap with the content of the first and pre-first levels of the Kanji Kentei test, the ultimate beast. Okay, I hope I was able to give you an idea about the differences between the Japanese Language Proficiency Test, also known as JLPT for foreigners, and the Nihongo Kentei test.